Hey, it's Krieger here, and as you can see, I chose a very simple topic to start my YouTube channel. I'll try not to get cancelled in my first video, but I can't make any promises. So trauma is the new religion, why some people never heal. And it's interesting that I still remember the sensation I had when I first learned about trauma. You know, this mysterious word seemed to be the reason why I felt like there was something wrong with me, why my relationships were terrible, and why I had zero motivations to work on my goals, which were also non-existent at the time. But an interesting phenomenon happened, because the more I learned about it, the worse I felt. Instead of this knowledge empowering me, it made me feel even worse and hopeless. When I researched about the common symptoms of trauma or CPTSD, I could see myself in almost all of them. It was very interesting and weird at the same time, because every day I'd find a new one to add to my special list of traumas. And if you don't have one of those lists, you should get one. They are absolutely great. So, fast forward to today, after 6 years of working as a therapist, I found that people who never heal are collectors of traumas, just like I once was. And I noticed that they get a weird rise when they can talk about every single terrible moment in their childhood and how their mom and dad made them suffer, and that one time when someone got them the wrong Christmas present or whatever. So in summary, they get absolutely enmeshed and in love with the traumas, and they become their whole identity. And not only that, they refuse any chance to get better and shame you when you present valid solutions. And this puzzled me for a very long time. I mean, sure, I learned about repetition compulsion and also the death drive postulated by Freud at the end of his life, which he kind of copied from Jung, but I'll let this one pass. But anyway, learning about this didn't seem to get to the bottom of it. But everything changed when I read Carl Jung exploring the religious function of the psyche. But come on now, I'm not gonna preach anything to you. It's important to understand that when Jung talks about God, he's not referring to a real existent metaphysical being, but to the psychic image of what constitutes the greatest amount of libido, the highest value operative in a human soul, or the imago Dei. So someone's God is what structures their whole psyche and consequently their whole lives. As Jung says in volume 6, there are men whose God is the belly, making a Bible reference, and others for whom God is money, science, power, or sex. And I add, work, a political movement, and even a relationship can be a God. And if you've been following the thread, nowadays many people worship their traumas as gods, and they allow them to rule their entire lives. And this new religion becomes the reason for their existence, as it provides a twisted sense of meaning to their lives. So, psychologically speaking, when something is your God, you filter your whole existence through these lenses, and this obviously impacts all of your behaviors and outcomes in life. So let's take a very simple example. When someone is a workaholic, their whole lives revolve around work. Their sense of self-worth is usually attached to how productive they can be, to the point that they can't even sit down for a few minutes without feeling useless. And this tends to impact all their relationships because work's always more important. And instead of making time for their partners, they're constantly thinking about making more money and working more hours. And not only that, they apply this work mentality to everything they do. So suddenly, a relationship is about meeting goals, do something productive with your partner, and following a tight script instead of rules. No, there's no room to have fun and just hang out. And the same thing happens with their hobbies. They don't know how to make something just for fun. So instead of learning music because you like it, they will transform that into another project with goals, metrics, and a lot of pressure to perform and become the next Bach or something. And with this simple example, I hope you can see how someone's God affects every decision and shapes someone's life. Now, applying what we've learned to traumas, people start creating their whole lives to accommodate and perpetuate their traumas. But let me stop for a moment and say that I'm not here to discuss if traumas are real or not, or even if they're valid. I'm interested in exploring why some people never seem to let go of them and truly heal. And as with everything nowadays, the psychological field is divided between people who treat this condition solely from a psychological perspective and people who treat it only as a biological and neurological condition. The problem is that every time you adopt a unilateral perspective, you create blind spots. And again, psychological approaches also become gods to many people. However, I learned something very important from Carl Jung. Truth emerges from sustaining the paradoxes. I could only heal from CPTSD and severe derealization when I combined both the psychodynamic and the modern approaches. And that's what I seek to apply with all of my clients. But for this video specifically, I want to explore the mentality of someone who never overcomes their traumas. And I noticed a few important traits over these years. And the first thing that happens is the adoption of a fatalistic and victimistic mentality. It doesn't matter how many solutions you provide, they create objections to all of them and constantly sabotage their process. They want it to work, but it has a lot of conditions. Like that person who wants to lose weight, but they don't want to change their diet or do any kind of exercise. And if they manage to commit to anything, as soon as they see something actually working, they immediately stop and go back to their old ways. They love to say that they are beyond salvation, and for a while I thought that this could be true. But then I became a therapist and started talking with people who have this mentality. And every time you investigate, you verify that they constantly half-ass everything. When they say that they've tried something, they didn't really try. They never go all in. And if something requires a little effort, they will create a bunch of excuses. Furthermore, I found that every time someone hangs on to their traumas, it's because they're avoiding something you call moral confrontation and taking some form of responsibility. As you might have noticed, many people treat their traumas as a get-out-of-jail-free card. And in other words, they remain in this childish position to avoid taking real responsibility for their lives and truly growing up. They exert something called control from the bottom, which is basically playing the victim card and emotionally manipulating others to give them everything they want. And when you meet someone like this, you're constantly anxious around them and feel like you're walking on eggshells. You overthink everything you're gonna say because you don't want to upset them and wake up the beast. In the end, they're basically a giant narcissistic baby constantly making demands. On a deeper layer, trauma becomes their whole sense of identity. And I might get some hate for saying this, but whatever. To many people, this happens because they want to feel special. They want their suffering to be unique and impossible to understand and cure. They want to have a rare mental disease never seen on the face of the earth. And again, many people adopt this mentality because there's nothing else going on in their lives. They don't want to put any real effort into bettering themselves, learning a real skill, and being in service of other people, because this would make them just a normal person, like everyone else. They don't want to be just human. They want the easy way out and be worshipped for the little effort they put in. An interesting thing to mention here is that Jung discovered that megalomaniac fantasies had the function of compensating for people's inferiority complexes. So when you don't face things in real life, you start living in a fantasy world to compensate for your lack of effort, results, and bad choices. And if you're familiar with the works of von Franz, you might have noticed that all of this perfectly encapsulates someone identified with the poor and puellaeternus archetype. Another very important factor to discuss here is that when someone has a victim mentality, they will adopt the unconscious behavior of constantly look for a perpetrator. In other words, everyone who challenges their perceptions is against them, even when you're doing your best to help them. But this doesn't stop there, because in severe cases, they will unconsciously seek for people who really don't have their best interests at heart to perpetuate this narrative in their minds. A perfect example of all of this is the new series by Netflix called Baby Reindeer. Despite the guy having several chances to change his life, he constantly chose to remain a victim. And in the end, he even went back to his abuse. In his own words, he says that he's addicted to hating himself, so he constantly sabotages anything good that comes his way. And I know that hearing this can be triggering for some people, so before you accuse me of anything, just watch this show and take your own conclusions. Lastly, I'd like to explore something extremely interesting. Traumas don't exist. However, this doesn't make them any less real. Hear me out. So when we study Freud and Jung, we learned that both of them let go of the trauma theory very early on, precisely because they understood they couldn't rely on a cause and effect formula. In other words, people might go through the exact same experience and react in very different ways. And this is nothing new, but what's traumatic to some people isn't for others. And this happens because of something called conscious attitude, which is basically our psychological predispositions or modus operandi. A modern way of saying this is that it's the subjective value we attribute to something that creates trauma. So someone who operates with a victim mentality, for instance, will find obstacles to everything, while someone who constantly seeks agency will be interested in how he can overcome it. And on a deeper layer, we have the notion of psychic reality. And this is a concept postulated by Freud that Jung expanded, which basically dictates that all of our experiences are mediated through the psyche, and therefore our subjectivity constantly trumps the objective reality. And it's very easy to see this in action. So let's say that you have a fear of cockroaches, and you're just hanging out, watching some Netflix. It's kinda dark so you can't really see well, but you have the impression that there's this black spot moving on the wall, and then you hear a weird flapping sound. So suddenly your heart's beating and you have a flip-flop in your hand, ready to kill that flying bastard. But after a few seconds you realize that it was just a weird shadow and the wind blowing. So even though there was no cockroach, you experienced a deep fear as if it were real. And nowadays we know that our brains have a really hard time distinguishing between something that is objectively happening and something that is just going on in their minds. And that's why traumas aren't real. However, it doesn't make them any less real, because when we believe in something, this affects us. And I'm obviously not here to invalidate someone's experience and be the judge of what is considered traumatic or not. I just want to offer a perspective that was very freeing for me, because we can't ever change the past. However, we can always work on our subjective perceptions and change in the present moment. And this reminds me of Jacques Lacan, because one of his ideas about healing is the ability to symbolize and bring into words what is traumatic. And retroactively, it is possible to transform our perception of the past and have more agency in the present moment. And I just witnessed that happening with a client yesterday. To put it very simply, he's been dealing with a tendency to never give himself credit for anything he accomplishes, and consequently, he never feels good enough. So every time he accomplishes a goal, he just thinks that this is what was expected of him and moves on to the next thing, no matter how big was his achievement. The problem is that this attitude gives no room to recognize his own talents, abilities, and his agency in all of that, because you're constantly trying to fulfill the expectations of others. Plus, you can't just breathe and relax. So after we explored all of that in a few sessions, he finally stopped to appreciate everything he went through, all the abilities he developed in the process, and how he's able to make his own decisions now. And what's interesting is that when he adopted a new perspective, he could also look at his past differently. Suddenly, mistakes and regrets don't seem as heavy anymore. And in all of those moments he felt like he was not good enough, he could finally realize how smart he was, how difficult were all of the challenges he surpassed, and how much agency he had all of this time. And he was like, wow, you're right, look at everything I was able to accomplish, I'm so fucking smart. I don't know, it's just very good when I can see clients who are reacting in that way. It's very rewarding. So these new perspectives change the way the past affects us and gives us new tools to appreciate the present moment and create the life we want. Plus, you notice how people change the way they talk about their pasts. You know, it's not heavy and full of guilt and shame anymore. They can finally stop carrying all of this baggage. So after everything we discussed, Jung says that healing is a religious problem, not because he's trying to create a new religion, but because on a deeper level, healing from trauma requires that we craft our own cosmovision. You see, traumas replace a real sense of meaning and purpose. And it's only when we strive to confront our fears and why we've been enmeshed with our traumas that we are free to look at ourselves and the world in a new light. We had to question ourselves as to why we keep repeating the same patterns over and over again. If this keeps happening, it's because there is an unconscious part of ourselves fueling these dynamics and narratives. And these parts are called complexes, and I will address them in future videos. So we must choose the perspectives that gives us the most agency, because ultimately, to heal from trauma, we must craft our own values and create a new and unique sense of meaning. We must stop allowing fear and shame to dictate our entire lives and finally start creating our audacious lives. You get to choose what or who will be your God. As Jung says, ultimately, anything inescapable can be called God. Man is free to decide whether God shall be a spirit or a natural phenomenon, like the craving of a morphine addict, and hence whether God shall act as a beneficent or a destructive force. Lastly, everything we discuss here, including complexes, the poor and eternus, and the shadow integration process, can be found in my free book Pistis Demystifying Jungian Psychology. And you can claim your free copy by joining the Audacity newsletter in the link down below. If you want a shortcut, you can get my very accessible and best-selling course, Catabasis, the Shadow Integration Manual. Or you can come directly to the Audacity University and access all of my courses, participate in live meetings, and receive my guidance. Thank you so much for watching, and until next time.